Everyone saw the clipboard, but no one asked why. Why were they here less than 2 days after I moved in? Why were their sunglasses hiding more than the glare of the morning sun? I had not even unpacked my last box when they stood on my porch smiling, like they owned everything they saw. "You will need to give up the dock," one of them said flat and sharp, as if he was reading a law already written. "It is part of the HOA now." Just like that. They declared it theirs without knocking, without explaining. Without a hint of doubt, I nodded like a man who did not care, but inside I felt a cold knot form deep in my chest. People forget what others are watching when they think they have control, but I was watching, and I was listening, and I knew this was only the beginning. I had dreamed of this moment for 2 years. At 42 years old, standing with coffee in hand on my own lakefront property, watching the sunrise paint the water, gold 15 years of saving from my county job had led me here. Modest house, but a perfect dock 30 feet of sturdy wood stretching into the lake like a promise. The previous owner had let it go, but the bones were strong. I spent every evening sanding, painting, tightening bolts, blue paint like ocean waves, little LED lights glowing like stars when the sun went down. This was my peace, my hard-earned prize, morning coffee afternoons, fishing quiet nights alone with the sound of water lapping. For the first week it was bliss. Then came the sound of heels crunching, dead leaves behind me one morning. I turned and saw her, tall, blonde, perfect hair, pastel cardigan basket of muffins that smelled too sweet to be real. She smiled wide, but the smile stopped at her eyes. I felt like a student being judged on the first day of school. She extended her hand. "I am Celeste Morrison, HOA president for this wonderful neighborhood. Welcome," she sang in a voice that was both soft and sharp. I shook her hand, wiped with paint, still on my fingers, and tried to be polite. First impressions matter, I told myself. She asked about the house, offered a muffin, spoke with the cheer of a magazine commercial. Then her eyes shifted to the dock. "This community dock looks amazing after your repairs," she said. Community dock. Her words cut deeper than a blade. My grip tightened around the coffee mug. "Excuse me," I asked slowly. "This is my private dock on my property." Celeste chuckled like I was a child mispronouncing a word. "Oh no, that is not correct," she said. "All waterfront structures are community assets, under HOA regulations." She pulled a photocopied sheet from her purse, highlighted in yellow. "All waterfront amenities shall maintain community access for aesthetic and equity purposes." She handed it to me like a lawyer presenting evidence. I stared at. The paper feeling slapped across the face, but I kept my voice level. "I will need to review my deed and documents," I told her. "Maybe there is confusion." Her smile stiffened. "I certainly hope there is no confusion." "Mr. Johnson," she said, with a taste of venom in my name. "We have our HOA meeting this Wednesday at 7 sharp. The dock issue will be our main agenda. I strongly suggest you attend." Strongly suggest. Not a suggestion at all. She turned and walked away, muttering about tea parties on my dock that I had worked with my own hands that night for the first time since moving in. I felt the peace of this place drain into fear. The next morning brought a letter stuck to my door, official HOA letterhead, Celeste's signature swirling at the bottom. "Violation notice, grass height exceeds community standard of 2 inches. Fine $25. I pulled a ruler from the drawer. 2 1/4. 2 1/4 inches of grass had made me a criminal in my new home. Tuesday brought another. Letter garbage bin left at curb 15 minutes past collection time. Fine $50. Wednesday brought the third mailbox, color not approved. Fine $75. My mailbox was black. They wanted forest green, navy blue, or burgundy. Each letter carried her flowery signature, like a stamp of war. The violations piled up like daily strikes against me. Doormat, wrong shade. Newspaper on the driveway. 12 minutes too long. Car parked at an angle not parallel to the house. Every morning, another envelope. Another accusation. Another attack. It felt like a watchtower stood over my house, measuring every inch, timing every step, waiting for me to slip. Wednesday evening, I walked into the community center hoping for reason. Instead, I found 23 residents, crowded in a small room staring at me like I was guilty before the trial began. Celeste sat at the head table, papers stacked like weapons, 2 board members silent by her side. She raised her chin with theatrical authority. The issue before us tonight concerns the refusal of the new resident to allow community access to our shared waterfront amenity. Shared waterfront amenity, my dock, my property. My right had already been renamed and claimed before my eyes. She raised a laser pointer to architectural, drawing small and unreadable from my seat. This structure, she said, was clearly designated for community use. Heads nodded like worshippers in a church. When I tried to raise my hand, she cut me off. We will hear from affected residents. First, affected. Residents, she called them. One by one they stood. Complaints about my paint choice, my lighting, my supposed ropes that never existed, each word rehearsed like a play. And each glance at me burned like a torch. I sat there silent, realizing this was not discussion. This was ambush. By the time Celeste finally let me speak, my voice carried a weight I could barely hold. I bought this property with a private dock. I said steady. My deed shows it clearly. I repaired it with my own money, my own time. I have blocked nothing except what is legally mine. The room buzzed, whispers, shaking heads, anger rising. I looked into their faces and I saw it. Not neighbors, not friends, but people who believed my dock was theirs before I even arrived. Everyone heard the gavel, but no one asked why it sounded more like a hammer nailing a coffin shut. The vote was already decided long before I stepped into that room. 18 hands rose to demand I restore community access to the dock within 7 days. 3 stayed silent, afraid to choose a side. 2 dared to vote against it, including one older man who shook his head like he had seen this play before. One leaned toward me as I walked out and whispered, "You are not the first they pushed out." Then he vanished into the night, leaving me with more questions than answers. I drove home through streets that felt emptier than before. Every shadow looked like a witness. Every window looked like an eye. And when I pulled into my driveway, another notice was already taped to the door, but this was no ordinary notice. It was thicker, heavier, and dressed in legal language that chilled my blood. Inside was a demand letter from Anderson and Associates. Remove the fence, restore community access, or face a lawsuit. That could drain $40,000 from my life, $15,000 in legal fees, $5,000 in court costs, $10,000 in punitive damages, numbers so large they were designed to scare me into surrender. And for a moment, they almost did. I sat at my kitchen table staring at that letter as if it were written in fire. What had I walked into? Was this really about a dock, or was it about something larger, darker? Was it worth it to fight? Would it be easier to sell, cut my losses, and move on? But then I looked out the window and saw the dock painted blue, glowing softly with the lights I had installed. It was more than wood and bolts. It was proof of every sacrifice I had made, and I knew I could not let them steal it. Not Celeste, not Gary, not anyone. The next morning, the war escalated. 2 new posts had appeared overnight, driven deep into the lakebed less than 10 feet from my dock surveyor. Flags flapped in the breeze like taunts. Small white tags marked them as official, but they carried no county seal, no state approval, private survey work, professional, hands-expensive equipment, and none of it with my consent. This was no longer HOA overreach. This was trespass pure and simple. I stepped into the cold water and examined the posts. The codes, etched at the base, told me everything. This was the work of a developer's crew, the kind hired when someone plans to build something big and costly. They were measuring my land as if they already owned it. The anger in my chest burned hot. but then cooled into something sharper. Colder, because I realized they had made their first mistake. They had left evidence. I photographed every angle, every tag. Every flag I documented it with the precision of a man who had spent years fighting bureaucrats in county offices. This time I had proof. This time I had them. When I looked across the inlet, I saw him, a man in a fleece vest, standing perfectly still, clipboard in hand, sunglasses covering his eyes. He did not move. He only watched. He studied my reaction, like a predator studying prey. And I knew he would be back in the house. I called the number on Celeste's card. She answered on the second ring with cheer. Too sweet to be real. Good morning, Mark. I was expecting your call, expecting my call. That meant she already knew. Those posts were installed by our engineering consultants, she said. We need accurate boundaries for community improvements. Community improvements on my land without my consent. That is trespassing? I snapped. Remove them. Now. She sighed, as if I were a child refusing to share toys. The posts are temporary, she said. We are designing community access structures. Community access structures. On my waterfront. On my dock. She was telling me the future as if it had already been written. I sent a cease and desist letter that night. Certified mail signature, required copies sent to the county, and the sheriff. I wanted them to understand this was no longer neighborly dispute. This was legal warfare. The following morning, I opened my mailbox and felt my skin crawl. Nothing missing, but the lock had been pried open. A message clearer than words. We can reach you anywhere. That afternoon, as I pushed the mower across my lawn, measuring every blade to keep within their sacred 2-inch rule, a man approached. He was older, bald smile painted on like cheap varnish navy polo shirt tucked in. Too tight, Gary Wells, he said. HOA Vice President. I hear you are having difficulties. I would not call them difficulties. I replied, more like harassment. He chuckled and began to talk about harmony, about 20 years of rules about protecting values, but the whole time his eyes never left my dock. Not with anger, but with hunger. Like a man staring at something he already planned to take. He flipped open a binder, and I saw the seal of his construction company stamped on old easement filings. Conflict of interest plain as daylight. He closed it quickly, but not quickly enough. He spoke about guidance, about cooperation, but I saw what he really meant. That Sunday, I came home. With groceries and stopped dead in my tracks, a family of 3 had set up a full picnic on my dock beach chairs table. Music echoing across the water beer cans on the railing, chip bags in the wind, a child swinging from the lights I had installed. These were not my guests. I had never seen them before. "Excuse me," I called out. "This is private property." The man barely looked up from his sandwich. Celeste said, "This is community dock," he answered. "Every resident has the right to use it." Heat rose in my chest. Anger so sharp it almost stole my voice. I wanted to shout, I wanted to fight, but I did not. I stood still, watching them eat and laugh on what was mine. When they finally left, leaving trash behind, I made my decision. The next day, I bought iron fencing, a lock and a sign that said private property. No trespassing. I installed it myself, each bolt tightening like a heartbeat of defiance, and when I finished, Gary was standing behind me again. This time, no smile. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice cold, protecting. "My property," I said without looking up. He circled the fence, eyes sharp, calculating every inch finest dock in the neighborhood. He muttered, "Perfect location, excellent view. Some people appreciate beautiful things, others do not deserve them." He looked at my house as he said the word unworthy and then walked away, his footsteps echoing like a threat. And I knew this was no longer about rules. This was war. Everyone saw the email, but no one asked what stronger measures really meant. The subject line alone made my chest tighten. Unauthorized construction violation, remove structure within 24 hours, or the HOA will take stronger measures. I read it 3 times, trying to understand what stronger measures could possibly be. Then I looked out the window and saw him, Gary, standing on the sidewalk, staring at my house. Not hiding, not pretending, just watching. And in that moment, I knew they were done playing games. The following evening, the community center overflowed with neighbors, not just the usual handful who came for meetings, this time faces I had never seen before. Whispers rippled through the room like wind before a storm. Celeste sat at the head table with Gary beside her briefcase gleaming at his feet. She looked more confident than ever, like a queen preparing for coronation. Tonight, she promised, would be the final resolution. Tonight, the dock issue would be settled once and for all. She raised her hands for silence. Fellow residents, she began, we have been forced to take serious action. Mr. Johnson has refused every reasonable attempt at cooperation. His obstinate behavior has already cost this community thousands in legal fees. I wanted to shout that no one had forced them to hire lawyers, but I stayed silent. The room nodded with disapproval as if I had already been convicted. Then she paused, and Gary rose slow, deliberate, theatrical. He opened the briefcase with ceremony and lifted out a document. Sealed in plastic sleeve, yellowed paper, neat signature at the bottom. Ladies and gentlemen, Gary said with courtroom weight, this is an addendum to the original purchase agreement signed in 1983. It proves beyond doubt that this dock was always intended for community use. He held it up, turning slowly so every eye could see. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for proof. Even I felt a tremor of doubt. Gary read aloud. The owner agrees to allow reasonable shared access to boat dock facility. For community use understanding, this enhances property values for all residents. He set the paper on the table like it was a crown jewel. Neighbors murmured with triumph. Celeste smiled like victory was already hers. But when the document reached my hands, I knew the truth. The smell was wrong. Real old paper carries a musty organic weight. This smelled of chemicals. The ink was wrong, too. Modern, two smooth edges machine cut, not aged, and the signature showed hesitation, pressure, uneven, as if copied. Not written. I could have shouted forgery right then, but instead I kept my voice calm. This is certainly an interesting document. I said, given its legal importance, I am sure the HOA attorney will want professional authentication. Forensic examiners can verify. Age of paper, ink composition, handwriting pressure takes 2 to 3 weeks and costs about $2,000, but it is required in court. The words cut like knives through Gary's confidence. His expression flickered. His voice trembled. That will not be necessary, he snapped. Too quick. Too defensive. And the room knew it. Celeste turned to him, confusion in her eyes. Gary, you did not mention authentication, she said softly. Should we not have done that already? The crowd shifted now, uncertain whispers, turning into suspicion, and for the first time Gary's mask slipped. He stammered words without weight, his forehead shining with sweat. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Voices rose, neighbors demanded answers. Celeste called for recess, but the damage was already done. They smelled blood, and it was not mine. When the room emptied, Gary found me in the parking lot. His face twisted with rage. So smart with your technical analysis, he hissed. You have no idea what you have unleashed. His words dripped venom, but behind them I heard something else. Fear. That night I planted survey flags along my true boundary, set up motion lights on the dock path, filed injunctions county civil and environmental. I was no longer defending. I was striking back. The next morning, I walked into their lakefront picnic armed not with food, but with papers, court orders, survey flags, drone camera recording everything. Neighbors who had once whispered against me now looked uncertain. They had seen the crack in Gary's armor, and they began to wonder if perhaps they had been following the wrong leader. Word of forgery spread like fire. By evening, people came to me with stories. Mrs. Patterson told me how Gary had once tried to ban her bird feeder because it attracted unwanted wildlife the day. Young couple revealed how he had called code enforcement on them for parking in their own driveway. Arthur explained how Gary had bullied neighbors for decades with lawsuits and threats. One by one, the picture formed. This was not about harmony. This was about control, and Gary had been using Celeste as his shield. Celeste herself confronted him in the parking lot days later. Witnesses said she screamed at him, mascara running down her cheeks. "You made me look like a fool." She shouted, "I trusted you, and you used forged papers to drag me into your vendetta." Her words were loud enough that even those who once supported him turned away. Gary had lost his most powerful ally, and he knew it. But I did not celebrate. Not yet. Because I knew men like Gary never leave quietly. They plot, they wait, they strike when you least expect it, and when he came again, I had to be ready. So that weekend, I drove to the county planning office. I dug through dusty files, records older than most houses in the subdivision hours, passed in silence, broken only by the shuffle of paper. And then I found a clause buried in the original development agreement of 1982. 15-foot easement along entire lakefront deeded to county for public waterway access and environmental. Buffer maintenance, 15 feet of shoreline that no homeowner truly owned, which meant everything they had built on that strip was illegal, and the only legal dock standing was mine. The paper trembled in my hand, but not from fear, from power, real power, backed by law and time. For the first time since this nightmare began, I smiled. Everyone saw the deputy, but no one asked why he was holding 3 sealed envelopes in his hand, civil court land court state environmental office filed that morning. By me, I walked to the center of the dock during the so-called community picnic and held up a bright orange survey flag. "This is where your authority ends." I told them. The crowd gasped. Voices rising like waves. The deputy passed the envelopes to Celeste, and for the first time her confidence cracked. The picnic was supposed to be a celebration, show of strength by the HOA, but instead it became a public unraveling. Neighbors who once shouted against me now turned to one another whispering. "We trusted you, Gary," one woman cried, her voice sharp. Others pulled out phones, filming every second. The live stream caught Celeste backing away, her eyes wide with fear, as if she realized the entire neighborhood was watching her crumble in real time. Within 1 month, Gary's downfall was complete. The forgery, the threats, the secret deals all exposed. The HOA board fractured. Celeste, furious and humiliated, turned on him with fire. She screamed in the parking lot that he had used her desire for order to fuel his vendetta. Witnesses said her mascara streaked down her face as she swore she would never forgive him. For the first time, she looked less like a queen and more like a broken woman. Caught in a web, she did not weave alone, but Gary did not leave. Men like him never leave gracefully. He dug in his heels, desperate and dangerous. 2 weeks after, the vote removed him from the board. He made his final reckless move. At 3 in the morning, the sound of a chainsaw tore through the quiet neighborhood. Neighbors woke to flashing lights and shouts. Gary stood in pajamas and boots, cutting down mature oak trees along the property line between his house and mine. The problem was those trees belonged to the HOA. Not to him. It was destruction, pure and childish. A tantrum from a man who had lost everything but could not let go. Police arrived within minutes, multiple. Neighbors had called at once. They found him screaming about 15 years of injustice while sawdust clung to his clothes. He was arrested for destruction of community property, trespassing, and disturbing the peace. The value of the trees was $15,000 money. Gary no longer had. Watching him in handcuffs, his chainsaw silent, felt like the final scene of a movie where the villain finally faces truth. At his arraignment, he saw me in the courthouse hallway, his eyes hollow, his face pale. With rage and despair, "You destroyed my life over a stupid dock," he spat. "I hope you are satisfied." I looked at him calm, "Gary. You destroyed your own life. I just refused to let you destroy mine." The bailiff nodded as if he had seen this story play out too. Many times before, the court ordered restitution, probation counseling, and a permanent restraining order banning him from contact with me or my property. He could not survive it. The debts, the shame, the broken pride. He filed bankruptcy within 3 months, lost his house to foreclosure within 6, and moved out of state to live with his sister. His 15-year obsession ended in silence. The community healing began faster than anyone expected. With Gary gone, the poison drained out. The new HOA president, Mrs. Patterson, a retired teacher, carried herself with quiet strength. She insisted on transparency. No decision without community vote. No document without independent verification. People laughed at the irony that it took one dock war to make their neighborhood finally democratic, but the laughter was relief too. Relief that the nightmare was ending. Neighbors who once glared at me now knocked on my door with apologies. Arthur brought me homemade apple pie. You handled it better than anyone could have, he said. Gary, had this coming for 20 years, and you were just the one who stood firm. I listened and realized he was right. It was never only about me, it was about all of them, too. Even Celeste tried for redemption. She stepped down from leadership, but stayed in the community. 6 months later, she approached me with genuine tears in her eyes. I thought leadership meant control, she said, but it means protection. Gary twisted my fear of losing respect into a weapon, and I let him. I am sorry for the pain I caused. Now volunteers with an environmental group working to repair lakefront damage. For the first time since meeting her, I believed her. The county commended me officially. A letter praising my discovery of easement violations and my stand against corruption became a training example for other employees. I was asked to present at a statewide conference. Other counties called asking for guidance. 3 other HOAs reached out directly, desperate to fix decades of illegal development without collapsing like ours had. I realized then that standing up to bullies sometimes saves more than just yourself. It saves everyone who comes after. 1 year later, I sat on the dock, coffee steaming in the morning air. No notices taped to the door, no voices shouting across. Meetings. Only the water calm and mine again. Arthur waved from the trail. Mrs. Patterson tended her garden. New neighbors planted flowers where Gary's trees once stood. The silence was healing. What started as a dock dispute had become proof that bullies fall when truth stands firm. Proof that knowledge really is power-proof, that documentation is armor. And as I leaned back, listening to the soft lap of waves, I finally understood. The battles you do not choose still choose you, and when they do, you have to decide who you are. For me, the answer was clear. This dock was mine. This piece was mine, and no one would ever take it again. Everyone heard the chainsaw that night, but no one forgot the silence that followed. The silence of neighbors staring at Gary in handcuffs, his boots muddy, his pajamas torn, his rage louder than the saw he dropped. It was the moment the neighborhood finally understood the truth. This was never about harmony, this was about obsession, and the obsession had finally consumed him. But even after Gary's fall, I could not rest because the scars he left behind were not just on trees or paper. They were on people, on trust, on the fragile bonds that hold a community together. Neighbors avoided each other. Now whispers floated at the mailbox. Every smile was cautious, every greeting hesitant. The poison Gary had poured into the neighborhood still lingered. In the cracks of every fence, every walkway, every rule book. I sat on my dock one evening, watching the reflection of the moon dance on the water. For months, this place had been battlefield and prison both. Now it felt like a graveyard of battles fought, and wounds carried quietly. The dock lights glowed faint but steady. I thought of every night I had stood here ready for war, and I wondered if peace was even possible. That week, the HOA board called an emergency election. 3 members resigned without speaking. The weight of shame had pressed too heavy. The dock was legally redescribed as private use buffer zone by court order. No one argued. No one dared. It was the first unanimous vote I had seen in this neighborhood for the first time since moving in. I felt a shift. Not victory exactly, but something close, a sense that maybe, just Maybe I had not fought in vain. Then something unexpected happened. Celeste appeared at my door. Not with muffins, not with papers, not with threats, but with eyes swollen, red and voice barely steady. I wanted to say, "I am sorry," she whispered. "I thought being president meant control, but it should have meant protection. Gary used me. He played on my pride, my fear of losing respect. He twisted me into something I never meant." To be tears streaked down her cheeks, and for the first time I believed her. She had been cruel. Yes, but she had also been used. She told me she had stepped away from the board. She now spent her mornings volunteering with an environmental restoration group, cleaning debris, repairing wetlands, fighting the same battles I had fought in county offices for years. It was not redemption yet, but it was a beginning. And beginnings matter. In the weeks that followed, neighbors approached me one by one, some with pie, some with awkward words of apology, some with nothing but a handshake that lingered too long because words could not fix what they had done. I accepted them all. Not because I had forgotten, but because holding the weight of anger would crush me before. It crushed them. The county letter of commendation arrived soon after. It praised my discovery of easement violations. It called my stand against false authority a public service. Reading those words, I felt something I had not felt since moving in validation. Not from neighbors, not from strangers, but from the very system Gary had tried to twist. The letter went into my file, and I carried its weight like armor invitations. Followed conferences, statewide requests from other counties, other HOAs, desperate for guidance. Emails arrived from people I had never met thanking me for standing up because they too were fighting battles against boards drunk on power. I realized this fight had grown larger than me, larger than one dock, larger than one angry man with forged papers, had become proof that bullies collapse when the truth is relentless. Still at night, I sometimes lay awake listening for chainsaws or footsteps or the sound of another envelope slipping against my door. The habits of war do not fade quickly, but each morning the lake reminded me that peace was real too. The water lapped against the pilings, gentle and steady, like it had been waiting all along. Then came the strangest moment of all, a knock on my door. Not from HOA, not from police, but from a young couple new to the neighborhood. They had bought Gary's foreclosed house. Their children played in the yard planting flowers where Gary's trees once stood. They waved shyly and asked if I would help them understand the rules. Rules. The very thing that had been weaponized against me now asked about with innocence. I laughed and agreed, because maybe that was the true circle closing. The nightmare ending with life blooming again, where poison once lived. One evening, Arthur stopped by carrying a plate of apple pie still warm from the oven. He sat with me on the dock, his voice low and steady. "Son," he said, "you handled it better than anyone could have. Gary had this coming for 20 years. You were just the one who finally said enough." I nodded but said nothing, because he was right. This was never just my story. It was everyone's. The sun set gold over the water. The dock lights flickered on one by one. And for the first time since the day I arrived, I felt something stronger than fear or anger. I felt belonging, real belonging, the kind no board, no president, no forgery could ever take away. Everyone thought the war was over, but no one saw the last ember still burning under the ashes. Gary had been dragged away in handcuffs, his house lost, his pride broken. Yet the stories he left behind kept echoing through the neighborhood every week. Another neighbor came to me with tales of his intimidation, the bird feeder he tried to ban, the driveway he reported again and again, the threats, the lawsuits, the whispers. It was as if the man had spent years weaving a web of fear, and now that web hung visible in the morning sun, sticky and ugly. The HOA scrambled to rebuild itself from the ruins. Mrs. Patterson now, president, moved carefully but firmly. She demanded transparency, demanded votes, demanded truth. For once people listened, the room that had once felt like a court against me now became a place where neighbors argued and laughed and even agreed without fear. It was strange and almost healing. But I was not ready to celebrate, because I knew the poison of power does not vanish overnight. Lingers. It tempts, it waits for someone else to drink. I kept my guard up, because men like Gary were never truly gone. Even far away, his shadow stretched across the lake. I poured myself into work at the county office, filed reports on encroachment violations, showed other staff what to watch for, and soon other counties reached out. They asked for copies of my research methods, asked me to speak at meetings. 3 other HOA boards called desperate for help, untangling their own decades of illegal waterfront claims. Struck me then how wide the problem really was, how many people suffered quietly under the weight of fake authority, and how one fight could ripple outward like waves across the water. But still at night I heard it, the phantom sound of a chainsaw, imagined crunch of boots on gravel, the memory of envelopes taped to my door. Some wounds do not heal easily. They remind you even in silence what was taken and what was almost lost. Then came something unexpected, Celeste. Not the sharp president with rehearsed smiles, but a woman stripped of titles carrying nothing but honesty. She stopped me one morning on the trail by the lake, her eyes softer than I had ever seen them. "I know I cannot erase what happened," she said, "but I can try to make something good from the wreckage." She told me she now worked with an environmental group helping restore wetlands damaged by illegal development. It was small but real. And for the first time I believed her words carried weight, not performance. Redemption comes slow, but sometimes it comes. The neighborhood shifted too. People who once glared at me now waved when I passed. Children rode bikes near the trail, laughing without fear. The dock stood quiet, untouched, finally mine again. It no longer felt like battlefield. It felt like home. One evening, I returned from work to find a small group of neighbors waiting at my gate. They held papers in their hands. At first, I feared another ambush, another notice, another fight. But when I opened the door, they simply asked if I would review their new policies before they voted. "We trust you," one said quietly. "You know what to look for." That single word, trust, carried more weight than any victory I had claimed in court. Because trust was what Gary had stolen most, and now it was slowly being rebuilt. I sat with them long into the night, reading papers, explaining clauses, showing them what words really meant when twisted by people who thirsted for power. They listened, and when the vote came later that week, it passed, not with fear, not with threats, but with honest agreement. For the first time since moving here, I felt pride not only in my dock, but in my neighbors. Yet in the corner of my mind, I still held the memory of Gary's eyes that had promised revenge, even as he lost everything, and I wondered if one day his shadow would return. But then I looked at the lake calm under the stars and told myself this truth: even shadows fade when enough light shines. The county commendation came weeks later, a letter on official paper, calling my fight a public service. It went into my file, but it lived deeper than that. It reminded me that sometimes standing against bullies was more than survival. Sometimes it was service. Sometimes it saved not only yourself, but everyone else who would have been next. That night I sat on my dock, coffee steaming in the cool air. The lights I had installed years ago glowed gently across the water. Arthur passed on the trail, lifted his hand, and called out, "Evening, Mark." Children laughed somewhere, behind the houses. Peace had finally returned, and maybe that was the real victory. Everyone thought Gary was finished, but no one expected the desperate fire that still burned inside him. 2 weeks after the vote removed him, 2 weeks after the chainsaw humiliation, 2 weeks after neighbors turned their backs, he returned one last time, not with papers, not with survey flags, not with forged documents, but with fury. It was 3 in the morning when the neighborhood woke again to chaos. This time, not from envelopes or whispered threats, but from shouting and flashing lights. Gary had broken into the common area, swinging the chainsaw once more. He hacked at trees, ripped through branches, screaming about injustice and stolen property. The same words he had shouted for years, now louder, now cracked with despair. Neighbors called the police together. Their voices panicked. By the time officers arrived, half the street stood watching. Gary stood in the glow of headlights, hair, wild eyes burning. He roared about 15 years wasted, about a dock that was never his, about a community that had betrayed him, and then they took him away again. The charges mounted: destruction of property, trespassing, disturbing the peace. The court ordered restitution, probation counseling, and a restraining order forbidding him from ever stepping near me again. But even as I watched him led away in cuffs, I felt something unexpected, not triumph, not revenge, but sadness. Sadness for a man who had built his entire life around hate. A man who let obsession eat him until nothing was left. The months that followed brought change deeper than any policy or vote. The community looked at itself in the mirror and did not like what it saw. They realized they had let Gary's poison spread because they were too afraid to question it. They realized their silence had fed his power, and now with him gone they had to rebuild. The new HOA board set rules for itself. No decisions without community vote, no enforcement without clear proof, no president without accountability. For once, rules protected people instead of punishing them. The irony was sharp. The same system that had nearly destroyed me now slowly became shield instead of sword. Neighbors who had once treated me like an enemy now knocked on my door with apologies. Some brought pie. Some brought awkward words. Some just nodded with eyes that said more than words ever could. I accepted all of them. Not because they deserved it, but because carrying anger would only keep me chained to Gary's ghost. Even Celeste found her way to something like redemption. She no longer wore the crown of president. Instead, she picked up gloves and joined environmental cleanups. She planted trees where Gary had cut them down. She told me once in a voice, softer than I thought she could make, that she had learned leadership was never about control. It was about care. Her tears were real, and though forgiveness came slow, it came. The county letter of commendation arrived with weight, heavy and proud. They called me an example of persistence. They said my fight had protected not only my dock, but the entire county from future abuse. Other counties asked me to share my methods. Other HOAs begged for advice. I had become something I never planned to be, a shield for others fighting the same battles in different neighborhoods. Yet some nights, I still woke to silence too sharp, too heavy. I imagined footsteps on gravel. I imagined envelopes pressed against my door. The war was over, but scars do not fade quickly. I reminded myself that peace is not the absence of fear. It is the strength to keep living despite it. Then came the clearest sign that things had changed. The new family who bought Gary's foreclosed house invited me over. They planted flowers where the trees once stood. Their children laughed, running across the yard free from the shadow that had hung there for years. They asked me about rules about how to live here without making enemies, and I laughed because the very system that had once tried to crush me was now in my hands to explain. For once the rules meant safety, not punishment. One evening, Arthur sat with me on the dock as the sun bled gold into the water. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "Son," he said, "you stood when no one else would. You did not just save your dock. You saved all of us." I looked out across the lake and let the silence answer because words felt too small for the truth of it. The dock lights glowed. The water shimmered. And for the first time, I felt more than peace. I felt pride. Not the pride of winning a fight, but the pride of surviving it without losing myself. Everyone thought the story ended with Gary in handcuffs, but no one realized the real ending came later in the quiet. Not with sirens, not with shouting, But with peace, 1 year passed. The neighborhood transformed. The dock no longer battlefield, no longer. Courtroom exhibit no longer stage for forged papers. Now it was mine again. Morning coffee steaming in the air, water golden in the sunrise, silence broken only by birds and the soft lap of waves. This was what I had worked for all along. This was what had almost been stolen. Arthur walked by on the new public trail and raised his hand. Mrs. Patterson tended her flowers and smiled. Children laughed near the house that once belonged to Gary, planting tulips where trees had fallen, the same ground that had seen chainsaws and anger now carried life again. I watched it and felt the weight lift from my chest, but the lessons of war stayed. I understood now that bullies survive not by strength, but by silence of those around them. Gary had ruled through fear, because people let him. Celeste had followed, because pride blinded her. Neighbors had watched because questioning felt dangerous. And I had been the target, because I refused to bow. The dock became symbol not just of ownership, but of standing firm when others collapse. The county commendation hung framed on my wall. The words were formal, but the meaning was clear. Persistence matters. Documentation matters. Truth matters. It saved me, and it saved the community. Other counties learned from it. Other HOAs corrected their ways because of it. The ripples kept spreading long after the storm had passed. Still, some nights I sat on the dock and heard the echoes. The memory of footsteps, the rustle of envelopes, the gavel striking like thunder. But then the lights I had installed glowed steady against the darkness, and I remembered that fear only wins when you surrender. I had not surrendered, and I never would. Celeste herself changed more than I thought possible. She worked with the restoration group every week. She planted saplings where Gary had cut oaks. She taught others about protecting rather than controlling. When she approached me with apology, months later, I believed her leadership had broken her pride, but rebuilt her heart. And maybe that was redemption enough. Neighborhood, too, had grown stronger. Votes were open, documents verified, decisions shared. It was not perfect, but it was honest. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I belonged. Not because I had been accepted, but because I had endured on a Sunday morning. I sat on the dock, coffee in hand. Arthur waved. Children played. Mrs. Patterson hummed in her garden. The young family laughed, planting flowers in soil once soaked with anger, and the water shone like glass under the sun. This was peace earned, not given, peace fought for, not gifted, peace carved out of defiance. The moral came not in speeches, not in laws, but in silence. Sometimes battles find you when you do not ask. Sometimes enemies choose you before you even arrive. And sometimes the only way forward is to stand even when standing costs everything. Because dignity is not about pride. It is about refusing to let someone steal what is rightfully yours. I never liked confrontation. I never wanted war. But this fight taught me that boundaries matter, that truth is armor, that knowledge is weapon, and that silence is surrender. I will never forget that lesson, and I will never let it be forgotten by this neighborhood. As the water stilled, I breathed in deep. No more notices on the door. No more forged papers, waved like flags. No more voices claiming what was never theirs. Just quiet, just clarity, just the dock mine again. So I ask you this, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have bowed to them? Would you have walked away? Or would you have stood firm? Like I did drop a comment, I read every one, and if this story struck you, there is a little thanks button below. No pressure, just appreciation, because standing against bullies is never easy, but sometimes it is the only way to protect what matters most. You've heard this confession. Now wait until you hear the next one.